In the last lesson, we looked at the concept of the first past the post voting system. We looked at how it works, what it's used for, and also some of the advantages and disadvantages that we can assign to it. In this lesson, we're going to talk about another electoral system, this being the supplementary vote, system. So, the supplementary vote system is currently used in a number of local and smaller elections, so it should be noted that we're not using this in any kind of general election. Let's put not general election. So no general elections or even quite large elections, but mainly for local elections. And examples of this include elections for the Mayor of London. This is actually quite a big. That's quite a big election, to be fair. And also police and crime commissioners. They also use the supplementary vote system, which is quite interesting because sometimes when you have a local election, you'll also be voting for police and crime commissioners, and you might have to do a lot of checking of the boxes, if you will, in these elections. Ultimately, how does the supplementary vote work? Well, according to the supplementary vote, for a candidate to win, they would need a 50% plus 1, okay, which is obviously just a majority of the votes, okay, so a majority. And we could probably make it even more specific. We could talk about it being an absolute majority, okay. Now, this is obviously in contrast to the first past the post system, because if you remember, the first past the post system requires there be a plurality, which means they don't need 50%, they don't need any actual percentage. All they need is one more vote than the number 2, okay? So that could be 30%, that could be 20%, okay? If there's a lot of candidates running an election, it might be something as low as 20 or 30%. And that's what it works for first past the post. But for this, we need an absolute majority. We need 50% plus 1 vote. And so in doing so, when the electorate go into the booth to mark their preferred candidates down, what they do is they have a preference system. Okay, so the electorate will list 2 preferences for their candidate, for their preferred candidate to win. Okay, and so you would have a first preference and you'd also have a second preference. Simple as that. And if no single candidate gets a majority out of all the first preferences, so if we get a number of people, okay, we have first preferences and second preferences, we will then take all the first preferences votes, count them all up, and see if somebody's got a majority. If somebody's already got a majority out of those first preferences, well, then there's no need to talk about the second preferences because that person has already won. So the first preferences go in, and if there isn't a majority, then what we do is we take the second preferences, except for those who are in the top 2, and we add them to the first preferences to find the ultimate winner. Okay, so let's think about it. So if we have candidate A, B, C, and D. Okay, we've got 4 candidates, and let's say that most people put their preferences in. Okay, and let's say in the first preferences, so let's just say in the first preferences, okay, we have a system where the candidate A gets 30, candidate B gets 10, candidate C gets 20, and candidate D gets 40. Okay, I think that makes up 20, 30, 40, 50, yeah, I think that makes up 100. These are all percentages. Okay, now these are in the first preference. None of them have got a majority, okay? So what we do is we then look to the second preferences, okay? We take away the top 2, okay? So we don't count the second preferences for the top 2. We look at the second preferences and we add them all to the first preferences. And you might end up with a situation where this person will eventually, the winner, maybe first or second place, might get one of them might get 50%, and one of them will get 50% in this situation. So let's just say this one gets 50%, this one stays at 40, nobody gave them a second preference, okay, and then these two stayed in a similar place as well. So ultimately, with these preferences, it's the first preference that if we get a 50% majority, that's a good thing. That means we don't have to worry about the second preferences. The second preferences are there to try and supplement the first preferences votes and to make sure that we are guaranteed an absolute majority of one of these candidates with the second preferences votes. And that's ultimately a very messy way of trying to understand it for you right there. Now, there are some interesting examples and there are some interesting advantages to the supplementary vote system. The first of this being that it would increase the legitimacy of the winner because they need an absolute majority. Okay, so if the winner gets 50% of the vote, or 50% plus 1, okay, then that means that there's a 50% plus 1 of the constituents of the electorate that actually support this candidate. We don't have any kind of messy system where with first past the post an MP might get elected with only 30% of the vote or something ridiculous like that. We have an absolute majority that needs to be achieved, and this increases legitimacy for the winner. The supplementary vote also gives a greater choice. Okay, so you might have a situation where you can't pick between candidates. Well, in this situation with supplementary vote, we don't have to. We can have a preference. You can say first preference, second preference, and there you go. And that's a great way of being able to choose more than one candidate and having your second preferences also count towards the final vote total. And this obviously would allow for should be able to allow for some minor parties to get votes and even a chance at victory. Now, on the other hand, there are also a lot of disadvantages. Okay, the first disadvantage is the same as the first past the post because they're both not proportional systems. Okay, now don't forget proportional systems would result in the percentage of votes, okay, equaling or at least estimating at least the percentage of seats won. So if, for example, our general elections were proportional, if one party gets 30% of the votes, then they would get around 30% of the seats in Parliament. Now, for a proportional system, it doesn't have to be exactly 1-to-1, the exact percentage on each, but for it to be around the same. So if you get 30% of the votes and 31% of the seats, that still would constitute a somewhat proportional system. But supplementary vote isn't a proportional system, neither is first past the post, so we can actually levy the same criticisms about supplementary votes as we did about first past the post in relation to the fact that they're not proportional. So you can talk about the UKIP situation in 2015 where they got I believe it was like 3 million votes. They got 3 million votes, okay, and then they got 0 seats in Parliament. And that's because obviously the geographical concentration of those votes were not in any constituency that was enough to actually win them a single seat. That's what we could talk about there. Another disadvantage is, even though minor parties might get some more support at the first preference stage, they're still unlikely to win. And this again can be levied against against first past the post as well to an extent. So again, minor parties, while maybe get some more support in the first preference or even the second preference stage, they're still very unlikely to win. Ultimately, the popularity of these major parties in this sort of growing two-party system that we're seeming to find ourselves in, this is something that supplementary vote cannot, get past. And this brings us to our next criticism, which is that in a constituency where we effectively have a two-party system, okay, the supplementary vote system would still lead to a number of wasted votes. Because even if we have our first preference and our second preference and we have to have a absolute majority to win, if you have a system where, or a constituency or a particular election that was very heavily just a two-party system, a two-party election where the vast majority of the votes are going to go to these two parties, then if you vote for somebody else, then that's just going to be if you vote for one of these parties and in the first instance that one party that you voted for got 70% of the vote or 60% of the vote, well then there's a lot of wasted votes there. There's a lot of people, because they don't need that. You still, even though it's not a plurality system, you still, and you need 50% plus 1, okay? Anything more than this will just equal wasted votes. Okay? So even if we have a situation where we have to have a majority, okay, we don't have to have a plurality, this is more legitimate, and we have our preferences, and we have our preference system like we have with the supplementary vote, even if this is all the case, if somebody gets more than this total, this absolute majority, then any vote above this counts as a wasted vote. Simple as that. And this might be a problem that is, an issue for all electoral systems. We have to think about how we can have a system where if there's a big win, if there's a huge majority, how can we argue that those were not wasted votes? Another criticism, the final criticism, is if a second preference is required, then we could end up with a candidate that most people didn't really want. Okay, if nobody gets a victory, nobody gets a majority in the first instance, but we have somebody who has a plurality. Okay, if let's say we have candidates A, B, C, and D. Okay, and we have in the first instance, in the first preference, okay, candidate A is in the lead. Okay, candidate A is in the lead. They have the plurality of the votes. Maybe they've got 10-15% more than all the others. And then if we get to the second preference, okay, and we add up the second preference votes, what happens if then in that instance candidate A loses the lead and candidate C gets the lead? Okay, well then we found that what we have here is that the second preference votes of the reason why we get this candidate. So it implies that for the most part this was the candidate C's candidate C was a lot of people's second preference. So we could end up with a system where even though for the most part the first preference went to A, okay, just because A didn't get the absolute majority that they need, the second preferences all end up going to C. So we end up with a candidate that people didn't really want, people's second preference candidate. For the most part, people wanted candidate A. So this could be a situation that we end up having. And these are a number of disadvantages that we're going to have to think about. And even though we have a system that is arguably more legitimate, and we have a system where it gives us a greater choice with the preference system, there are definitely disadvantages to the supplementary vote electoral system.